Matthew Fernandez, and I want to give you guys a quick message and sermon here for the Youth Prayer Week. And the title of my sermon is "To Love is to Worship." So, in a recent TV ad, there was a young man who was torn between whether or not to go ahead with an arranged marriage, because in his country, arranged marriages were the norm. However, after he lived in the United States, he was very hesitant and questioned if he was going to go through with it. Even with that hesitance, he flew out to the airport and he waited for his soon-to-be wife, obediently with flowers in his hand. But as soon as the wife showed up, his gloomy expression just immediately changed. It had turned out that the woman was gorgeous, and as I said, suddenly his gloomy expression changed. The thought of marrying this woman was no longer a fear of his, but an actual delight. So that bears the question, what had changed? And what had changed was that he had been able to see her. We can apply this into the real life and the real world as a Christian, and we can say we often serve and worship God out of obligation and not, actually within. We crawl into church, force ourselves to serve others, forced to worship, forced to pray and read the Bible, and that kind of makes us like that man at the airport. We try to live holy because we know we must, but it is heavy for us. We do not do it with joy. But just like the man at the airport, this can all very quickly change as long as we see God. When we have a vision of who God really is, we suddenly feel more energized to go and fulfill his mission. When we contemplate his greatness and his glory, we just tend to worship, and we don't do it out of because we're forced or because we feel like we have to, more so because we genuinely want to do it and we find joy in doing it. Once we truly understand his great love, serving and worshiping will no longer feel like a duty, but it will feel more like a joy. In speaking of love as an action, we cannot overlook the subject of worship, since to love God is to worship. Now, there may not be a topic that brings more controversies and conflicting opinions than the subject of worship, because many times, whenever the subject of worship is discussed, people go to the topic of music. Let me tell you that in our sermon today, we will not go into the endless discussions that revolve around the subject of worship. Rather, we will look at some biblical passages that show what true worship produces in the life of believers. We will focus specifically on 3 biblical passages recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. And let's begin by reading Matthew chapter 2, verse 11 through 12, which says, "When the men went into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother, they knelt down and worshipped him. They took out their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and gave them to him. Later they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, and they went back home by another road. So the kings of the east, who were astronomers and scholars of prophecy, came from a distant land with the intention of worshipping the king who had been born." Can you imagine the time these men spent on their journey to meet Jesus and worship him? They were willing to endure the difficult road and the inclemency of the weather just to worship the Lord. And when they found him, they fell before him and offered him their costly gifts. What happened to them then? The story goes that after worshiping the Lord, they were warned in a dream not to return to King Herod, and they went back home by another road. Friends, without wishing to trying to add anything extra to the Bible passage, we can say that everyone here who truly worships the Lord will return home by another way. In other words, a change of direction and purpose will occur in your spiritual life and experience. A second passage that speaks of the efforts of true worship can be seen once again in Matthew chapter 14 verse 32 through 33, which says, "When Jesus and Peter got into the boat, the wind died down. The men in the boat worshipped Jesus and said, 'You really are the Son of God.' The story goes that a great storm threatened to sink the disciples' boat. In the midst of that storm, Jesus came to them, walking on water. When they saw him, the frightened disciples cried out, thinking that he was a ghost. But Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take courage, I am, fear not.' It is then that Jesus enters the boat, and miraculously the storm stops, and the raging sea is calm. Observing the Lord's power, the disciples fell at his feet and started to worship him, for they had seen the Lord's power over the storm. They had experienced the peace that surpasses all understanding. Now they could do nothing but worship him. Prostrate at the feet of the Master, there was no room for fear. The insecurity was no more. The last verse I would like to share with you guys is once again from Matthew, and it is found in Matthew chapter 28, verse 9, which states, "Suddenly Jesus met them and greeted them. They went near him, held on to his feet, and worshipped him." The Friday before this took place, the Lord had been crucified, and the hopes of his followers had been dashed. Discouragement, defeat, and disillusionment had knocked at the door of each of them. Only some had remained at the foot of the cross. Most of them had run away and left the Master alone. But after all this, on Sunday, after the Sabbath, these brave women decided to go to the place. But to their surprise, the tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, and he himself went out to meet and said to them, "Hail." Seeing their resurrected Master, all these faithful believers could do was embrace the Lord's feet and worship him. In adoration of the risen Christ, his experience of seemed like defeat was changed into a victory. In conclusion, we can see how at first it may be hard or maybe boring to worship God, but if you really get to know him and see all his powers and his greatness, it becomes a joy. Like all these people in the Bible saw, after Jesus showed his powers and showed his love towards them, they immediately were overwhelmed with joy and began to worship him. That is my sermon. Thank you guys for listening, and may God bless you.